As we know, is a very globally minded state, and for many reasons, and we talk and brag about that, and that's really one of our strengths that we consider as part of who we are. As you are aware, the President's budget was recently released at a time when America's role in the world is being debated from Washington to around our kitchen dinner tables. And amid this ever-growing number of global crises and stakes truly have never been higher for America's global leadership and how important it is. Pulling back, especially now, is simply not in our nation's best interest. These are not Democrat or Republican issues. These are issues that affect every one of us as Americans. So our hope today is that when you leave here, that you will continue to discuss these vital issues and share what you have learned with your family, your friends, and your colleagues. Now, to tell us a little bit more about USGLC's work here in Utah and around the country, I would like to welcome Carrie Campbell, who is the National Outreach Director of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and an Auburn fan.
Thank you so much, Terry. Terry, thank you for kicking off today's program, but more importantly, thank you for being a great friend and partner to the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. It is really wonderful to be back here in Utah, and our first time ever in Lehigh. Wow, I don't know how you all ever leave this place. The scenery here is utterly gorgeous. I think you might have a new neighbor here pretty soon. We are thrilled to be here and so honored, Congressman Curtis, to host this event for you. Congressman Curtis and I were talking just a little bit before the event, and Terry acknowledged how timely this conversation is. We just didn't know how timely it was going to be. That Congressman Curtis recently took a trip that I look forward to hearing a little more about during your remarks. So before we kick off the program, I want to say a couple of thank yous. First and foremost, I want to thank each of you for being here today. As Terry said, you all are here because you care, and we appreciate that. I also want to say thank you to our National Global Impact Project partners, those names that you see up here on our screen. These are wonderful partners of USGLC that make the work we do around the country possible. We also have our local partners that are here, also up on the screen. Thank you so much for helping to make today's program a success and making our efforts here in Utah a success. And lastly, I want to thank those members of our Utah Advisory Committee. Two people chair our advisory committee here. We don't need to introduce them. I think you all know them very well. Former Congressman Jim Matheson and former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for International Trade, Lou Kramer. Great supporters of USGLC, and we are so thankful for not just their support, but also the rest of the advisory committee. So you saw some of the people who are here. We have a pretty good number of our advisory committee members here, but there are so many new faces and what I hope to be new friends of USGLC. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to tell you about the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, who we are, and what we do. We are a coalition of over 500 businesses, humanitarian organizations, and faith-based organizations, a group of individuals and entities that have all come together in support of America's civilian tools of national power, development, and diplomacy. We have a presence all across the country, thousands of people from Florida to Washington, Texas to North Dakota to right here in Utah. And I want to reiterate something that Terry said. It's shocking that in today's political environment, we are, in fact, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We all know that politics stops at our shores. We have our National Bipartisan Advisory Council, co-chaired by General Colin Powell, and it really is the who's who of the American foreign policy world. And we're really excited about our growing military voice, our National Security Advisory Council, one of whom we are honored to have here with us today. It's co-chaired by Admiral James Trevitas and General Anthony Zinni, and comprised of over 200 generals and flag officers. And working right alongside them, just as they did when they were in uniform, are 30,000 veterans for Smart Power. These are all individuals who at times of conflict and at times of peace have seen the direct impact of development and diplomacy and the benefit to America. Now, what brings us all together? Hopefully it's the same thing that brings us all together in this room, is the understanding that we live in an ever interconnected world, and that's getting smaller and smaller as the days go by. And we have this firm belief that America must stay engaged in the world. And in order to support our economic and our national security interests, we must be engaged not only with our military, but with development and diplomacy. And lastly, at USGLC, what we do is we tell a story. And the story that we tell is the impact of such a small percent of the federal budget, 1% of the federal budget. The return on investment of this 1%, the benefits that it pays off for these strategic investments. It's sometimes called the foreign aid budget. It's known as the international affairs budget, but it is so much more than just foreign aid. It's our embassies and our diplomats around the globe, as well as support for our key allies. It's our efforts to tackle and combat threats of terrorism and tackle pandemics like Ebola and Zika. It's programs that open new markets for American goods and services and create stability in the developing world. It's effective, it's transparent, it's smart, and it pays off for the American people. So now that you know a little bit about USGLC, I want to hear a little bit about you all in this room. So I have a little bit of an assignment. On your tables, you have some note cards, and it says Leading Globally Matters Locally at the top, I believe. So if you take one quick break from eating, I'd love for you to write down the answers to this question. Why does leading globally matter locally to Utah? Why does it matter to Lehigh? And why does leading globally matter locally to you? So I'm going to start the Jeopardy clock for about 45 seconds and give you a few minutes to write down your answers. And we will collect them. You don't have to write your name on them, but we do like to find out people's insights and their thoughts on these issues. So why does leading globally matter locally right here in Utah? So it looks like many of you are getting close to being done. So let me ask this. Raise your hand if you said leading globally matters locally with something to do with national security, that it keeps us safe or it's in our national security interests. 1, 2, 3. So what did you say, sir?
Well, unnecessary wars impacts all of us.
Right.
Not just the budget, but families.
Absolutely, absolutely. Who else said national security? I saw a couple of, one other hand. Yes, what'd you say?
I think if we don't adopt and maintain the centrist position, other people will come in and put their agenda above national security. That's a problem.
Okay, great, great. So there were a couple of others that said national security. So I just want to share with you, you all share the same belief as a few former combatant commanders who just recently, a couple of weeks ago, released a statement where they said that the military alone cannot keep America safe, and that we need our development and diplomatic programs, and that they're essential to combating threats, and combating those threats, more importantly, before they reach our shores. These are individuals who really understand that we have to use all the tools in our toolkit to keep us safe. So how many of you said that leading globally matters locally because it's the right thing to do, because it's who we are as Americans? Anyone? Yes, what'd you say?
I said because the world will not only be safer, but the lives of our brothers and sisters around the world will be improved as we share American and even Utah values.
Yes, yeah, that's great. Anyone else? Yes, what'd you say, sir?
Because Utah, like the U.S., is a microcosm of the world and draws its strength from positive global interaction.
Great, great. So you all believe, like USGLC does, and that's it, that philosophy that Ronald Reagan shared just a couple of years ago, that America is that shining city on the hill, that we are the most prosperous country, and we are the most giving country. And let me give you an example of how some prosperity that we've provided across the globe. About 15 years ago, President George W. Bush started a program called PEPFAR, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. That was 15 years ago. I'm just curious, does anyone know how many lives have been saved by this program in the last 15 years? You can just shout out a number.
15 million.
15 million. Anyone else? You're very, very close. In 15 years, we've saved 17 million lives from this one program alone. Think about the impact that makes. Think about the goodwill we've created by saving these lives. Think about the opportunities we've created by saving these lives. And this is just one program. But we can't stop here because we face so many more crises around the world. Two examples are the 20 billion people who are on the verge of famine right now, and the 70 billion people who are displaced, the highest number since World War II. It's an astounding number. So let me ask this. How many of you said that leading globally matters locally because there's an economic tie to it, that it's about the economy? Yes, somebody over here.
As it brought an economic base leading to increased quality of life here in Utah and across the country.
Great. Someone else, let's go to this. Anybody on this side of the room? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Utah considers itself the crossroads of the West and the crossroads of the world in a lot of ways. So we perhaps will depend on international trade.
Great. Well, these are smart people who understand that 95% of the world's consumers are outside of our borders. And the fastest developing market, or the fastest growing markets are in the developing world. In fact, 6 of 10 of those markets are actually in Africa. And believe this or not, I was sort of astounded by this statistic, that out of our top exports now, 11 of 15 of them used to be recipients of foreign aid. So wow, look, we see the investment, we see the return on investment already from where we're exporting now. But we're not the only ones who see this. You know, we've been competing for years against the UK, against Japan, against Germany. But there's a new competitor on the stage as well that we're hearing about every day, and that's China. They know, just like we do, that you need to be involved in the developing world if you want to continue to grow your economy. So there are a couple of experts who can talk about this, I think probably a little bit better than I can, so I ask you to watch them.
With our economy the way it is today, some people are asking why we're spending so much money overseas and not on creating jobs right here at home.
Well, actually, we're not spending much money.
Just 1% of our national budget goes to the international affairs budget. That's not a lot.
And helping create American jobs is just what that money's doing.
If you want to create jobs, you have to create more demand for products and services.
You need more customers. And where are American companies finding more customers?
Not here, but here. And here.
And here.
95% of the world's customers live outside the U.S.
95%!
When we sell goods to them, they're called exports. U.S. exports counted for a big part of our economic growth last year.
Half went to developing countries.
And their economies are growing 3 times faster than developed countries. And every 10% increase in exports equals a 7% increase in jobs here.
So, how do we increase exports?
Build new markets for American goods and services.
Remember that 1%? America's international affairs budget helps fund programs that improve health and education, supports agriculture development,
builds a stable economy,
and creates new markets. So if we don't go to the biggest, fastest growing group of consumers, other countries will. Other countries already are.
Investing a small amount in global development and diplomacy
is not only the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. To make our economy stronger. To create more jobs.
For my mom.
For my dad.
For my neighbor.
For me.
And I am, some of you I see some familiar faces here. Some of you might not know me. I'm the president and CEO of Kostopoulos Dream Foundation, known as Camp Kostopoulos here in Utah. We're located in Immigration Canyon. We've been serving this community for over 50 years, and our mission is to improve the quality of life of people with disabilities through education, recreation, and growth opportunities. We do all those things in Immigration Canyon, our beautiful campus. As we have been here for over 50 years, our scope and the work that we do has grown and developed quite a bit over the years. We have become a global company that we serve people from all over the world, that they come here in Utah. But even more important, we hire people from all over the world. We had staff on our campus from 23 different countries last year. So why did we decide to venture out into the world? We realized that if we venture out into the world, we will understand it better. We will give our staff from Utah the opportunity to get to interact with people from all over the world. And when people get to know and understand each other, that's a recipe for a better world. It's a recipe for success. So disability is the #1 cause for poverty in the world. There are over 1 billion people in the world that live with a form of a disability, 56% in our country. That's about 20% of the population of the United States. And it's a very significant part of who we are at CAMK. We understand very well diversity, and we understand very well inclusion at CAMK, as people come from different socioeconomic backgrounds and geographical locations. And we can't talk about diversity and inclusion, which is a very hot topic right now everywhere. Universities hire, VPs that deal with that, and leave. We can't talk about diversity and inclusion again and leave disability out. So if I would be to explain CAMK and why I am here today, talking to you guys and an advisor to the US GLC, and why this is such a passion for me. I am a naturalized American. I came into Utah 20 years ago. I was going to school to become a banker, and I ended up being a counselor at CAMK in 1998, and that changed my life. I got very passionate about making a difference in people's lives, and decided to not pursue a career in banking, but pursue a career in helping people. And in Camp Kostopoulos, if I would be to explain it to someone that doesn't know it, which is very similar to what US GLC does, it's an environment that helps overcome fear. Fear is a very powerful motivator. Fear affects us all. It's a very powerful emotion that holds us back from accomplishing success. We can't control something that scares us because fear will always get in the way. Most important question is, why are we so afraid of who we are? There are two types of fear, the fear of the unknown and the fear of the known. The fear of the unknown is you're afraid of pursuing or doing something because you don't know what the outcome might be, you haven't done it before. The fear of the known is you're going to be afraid of doing something because you probably tried it and you already know what the outcome might be. And at CAMK, we give people opportunities to overcome fear by pushing constantly outside of their comfort zone, trying new things, experiencing new things, and growth. And I'm very excited to have that vision and mission that we have at Camp Kostopoulos. I believe that our role is to always fight for those that can't fight for themselves, be the voice of those that don't have a voice, and bring light where there's darkness. And I think as Americans, as a country, we should always do that. That's what we do at CAMK, and I'm very excited to be part of US GLC and push forward the mission that you have to make the world, bring it together, make it better. So, Miles?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mircea, very much. Mircea is such a positive, powerful influence in our community. If you haven't been to Camp K, talk to Mircea at some point today, and I guarantee you he'll invite you, and then he'll twist your arm until you head up Immigration Canyon and go there. And I promise you, you won't regret it. It's a tremendous program, a tremendous value add in a service that they provide to our community. So I'm grateful for your leadership, Mircea, and I agree 100% in the value and the importance of global leadership. My name is Miles Hansen. I'm the president and CEO of World Trade Center Utah, an organization that helps Utah companies identify international growth opportunities and then take advantage of those. I'm a very proud member of USGLC's Utah Advisory Committee, and I'm here this afternoon on behalf of the many large and small businesses here in Utah and around the country who know that local economies are inextricably linked to the economic currents of the world. Right now, we all know that the United States, we are a country of 330 million people in a world of 7 billion people. That means that 95% of the world's consumers live outside of our country. And today's fastest growing markets are in the developing world. It can't be overstated that these are the markets of today and tomorrow. In order to advance American interests in these markets, we rely on strategic investments in diplomacy and economic development. Up until 6 months ago, I was working in Washington, D.C. at the White House on the National Security Council staff, and my job was to help coordinate the mechanisms of U.S. global leadership. And I can tell you that when I'd sit down there to chair a meeting, and we'd get everybody around the table, and you've got the State Department, you've got the Treasury Department, you've got the Department of Defense, you probably have 3 or 4 people from the Department of Defense, you have the intelligence agencies, you have USAID and many others, Department of Energy. And to be honest, at some points, I'd sit there and think, do we really need 15, 16 people around this table? But the reason why it was so important, what I learned during that period of my career, was that each and every element of U.S. global leadership is essential. It brings very, very tangible, real value for the United States of America, for the companies here, and also for the rest of the world. Those are the mechanisms that help us advance these 3 key pillars right here. And so I'm a true believer, and I feel very, very strongly that the United States continue to engage in the world because it benefits not only our own companies and our own individuals in our own country, but it has a leavening effect on the rest of the world. And I've seen that in very, very many different ways throughout a career in diplomacy and in national security in Washington, D.C. And I continue to see that right here in Utah. We know that 1 in 5 American jobs are tied to international trade, and that 1/3 of all manufacturing jobs in the U.S. are directly tied to our exports. I think it's important to highlight that that number is increasing. Since 2010, the investment in the United States in manufacturing has gone up 28 times. And there's a lot of factors and reasons why. I'd love to sit down and talk to you about it sometime. I won't bore you with it now. But I share that with you because it underscores that manufacturing is becoming increasingly important for our country. And manufacturing today is global in nature. Supply chains are global in nature. And so U.S. leadership around the world is absolutely essential. And that's why we understand that the critical programs funded by the International Affairs budget help to keep America competitive in the global marketplace, which is key to our economic prosperity here at home. And I know that Congressman Curtis and our guest speakers today share this understanding. And so I'm honored to introduce first our panelists who will speak after our guest of honor. And our panelists today will feature Vice Admiral Dick Gallagher, who served as the U.S. military representative to the NATO Military Committee until 2012. That was a culmination of 36 years of military service for our country. And please join me in giving him a round of applause to demonstrate our appreciation for that service. Also on the panel will be Derek Miller, who is president and CEO of the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce, Utah's voice for the business community in advocating and leading Utah's continued prosperity. He previously did a job that I know pretty well. He was the president and CEO of World Trade Center Utah, and it's an honor to try to follow in his footsteps. And I'm very, very grateful for his mentorship as I've come back to Utah and try to get caught up to speed here. It's been a tremendous asset to me. But I do have one bone to pick with Derek. When I got here, I'd wear ties everywhere I went. And I'd sit down and people would always joke, because Derek never wears ties. Why are you wearing a tie? And so I quit wearing ties, and here I am today. He's the only person in the room without a tie on. And Derek, you've got a tie on. That's exactly what it is. Constantly challenging, constantly keeping me on my toes. But I'm grateful for his friendship and his mentorship. And we will also welcome GLC's Carrie Campbell back to the stage to moderate that discussion. But before then, it is now my pleasure to introduce Congressman John Curtis, representing Utah's 3rd District. As a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Curtis has an important seat at the table when it comes to addressing today's global challenges. And he's become an advocate for America's global leadership as a critical way to advance our national security and economic interests. From his work in Congress to his travels abroad, he knows firsthand the importance of investing in America's development and diplomacy programs to address today's most challenging global threats. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our special guest today, Congressman John Curtis.
Thank you. Is this live? Can you hear? Oh, good. I am just delighted to be with you. I look around the room and see some of you that are just really good friends, and some of you that I haven't had a chance to get to know. I come here this morning really excited to talk about this topic, but I have to give you just a slice of my life before I start, so you'll understand if I'm discombobulated or off cue or off pace, because the last 2.5 weeks, I have slept in 12 different beds. My wife is in Washington, D.C. I came home from Washington, D.C. last night. She'll come home tomorrow, and I leave Sunday to go back. And this morning I woke up, I own 4 electric razors. I couldn't find one of them. And I got to the office, and Lori had been so good after my last trip down to the southern part of our district to bring some of my things back, and there on my desk was my electric razor, one of my electric razors. So I shaved on the car on the way over here, and thus is my life. So you'll understand if I hit and miss a few areas. I wanted to start by talking about something extremely significant. We just had a 40-year anniversary that I think the world totally missed. I didn't hear it talked about anywhere. And that was that 40 years ago on April 2nd, Anwar Sadat, Mahatma Begin, and Jimmy Carter signed that legendary peace treaty. Now, what's significant about that is that Begin and Sadat hated each other. They wouldn't even be in the same room. And to conduct those talks, President Carter had to shuttle back and forth, inching just inch at a time to try to reach consensus with those two. But due to his efforts, he was actually able to do that. And 40 years ago, those 3 stood on the lawn of the White House, shook hands in a 3-person grasp, and changed that part of the world in a meaningful way. Interestingly, I was 19 years old at the time, living in Jerusalem, and staying actually in Galilee the day that was signed. It was night over there. And Syria had threatened to invade Israel if it was signed over the Golan Heights. And I remember as a young 19-year-old standing in Galilee looking at the Golan Heights, kind of wondering if Syria was coming in that night. And of course they didn't. But it shows you that we can do hard things. It shows you the power of diplomacy and how if we are patient and bipartisan and work together, we can do some really significant things. Well, serving in the House of Representatives is a unique experience. I get the responsibility of representing you and Utah's values back in Washington, D.C. We're a unique culture, very unique. And I frequently find myself telling my colleagues about Utah. We're #1 in volunteerism year after year after year. We're #1 in charitable giving. We're very thrifty. Probably the most thrifty of any people I know. I frequently tell people I think Utah gets painted as ultra-conservative, mostly because we're so thrifty, but I think we're quite moderate on many other issues. Well, I've had a chance as a young missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to live in Taiwan for 2 years. As a businessman, I've traveled the Middle East and Asia, and now serving on Foreign Affairs Committee. And the one thing that is absolutely certain to me through all of this is that global leadership matters. It's so imperative. One of the things that didn't come up, I think it came up in a little way, but I want to emphasize it. If we don't fill that role as a country, China will. In every country I have visited, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Central America, and in South America, China has a presence, and they are trying to change who's leading around the world. And it's not the type of leadership that we want. They come in and they offer tremendous incentives to build infrastructure. They then foreclose on that infrastructure, and the ports, the seaports, the railroads become theirs. And it's not in America's best interest. Probably no person has said it better than General Mattis for his famous quote, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition." And that is so true. That's another reason that we need to lead globally. You can look at this from a very selfish perspective. That 1%, I actually hate to talk about it being 1% of our budget because it sounds like we're spending 1% of our budget on somebody else, and in my opinion, we're spending it on ourselves. We are saving far more money by spending that 1% than if we didn't spend it. We're actually saving, in my opinion, our men and women's lives who would otherwise have to fight battles if we weren't spending that money. Well, she mentioned that I'd had a chance to do some traveling, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. This last week I traveled to Colombia with a delegation. It was kind of interesting. I know we're nonpartisan here. There were 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and the other Republican left partway through the trip. And so it was very interesting from that perspective. But we sat with the president of Colombia. We listened to him talk about what it's like to receive an influx of immigrants into his country that would be staggering by any proportion here in the United States. About 1.5 million people have migrated in 2 years into his country, in a country of about 30 million. So do the math and imagine how that would impact us here in the United States. And they have a philosophy of absolutely receiving everybody, every person that comes into that country. Shortly after that, the very next day, we had a chance to travel to the Venezuela-Colombia border. And oh my goodness, it would just break your heart. We went to a soup kitchen, and there were thousands and thousands of people in this soup kitchen. And what I learned was these were not people who were coming to migrate into Colombia. Mostly these were people who had walked hours from Venezuela across the border into Colombia to simply have a good meal, grab everything they could to possibly eat or wear, and carry it back into Venezuela. And Maduro has closed the borders down there. There's a couple of bridges that go across, and he's dropped containers, semi-containers, in the middle of those to control traffic going back and forth. And so you see a small line of Venezuelans coming across these bridges, and then if you look off to the side of the bridge, you'll see masses of people teeming across the border, going both directions, coming from Venezuela with nothing at all, leaving back with suitcases and bags of whatever they can find to take back into Venezuela. The average Venezuelan has lost 23 pounds in the last 2 years. Can you imagine the human suffering that's happening down there? Maduro has refused to allow humanitarian aid into the country. We saw beautiful, fabulous new warehouse stacked full of humanitarian aid from the United States and other countries, unable to move across the border into Venezuela to help these good people. And Juan Guaido, who is the legitimate leader trying to get in charge of that country, is worried about his life, the life of his wife, and it is a human crisis of epic proportions. And there is probably no better example in anything that I have ever seen in the need for diplomacy at our highest levels. Not just the United States, but every country has got to come together and apply diplomacy, because if we don't, this doesn't end well. There's no possible good ending. Well, as interesting as that was, we left Colombia and went to El Salvador and had a chance to sit down with law enforcement, FBI, and listen to what they were doing to control MS-13 in the United States. And it would be mind-blowing to all of you to see what's happening in El Salvador, impacting us here in the United States with MS-13, and how it's run out of the prisons in El Salvador, impacting us right here. We also saw U.S. aid, how it has taken these young kids, and the gangs are out of control in El Salvador. I learned that there are neighborhoods, if you are from one of those neighborhoods, simply your ID alone condemns you as a gang member. And so if you're a youth from one of these neighborhoods, the police will ask to see your ID, and if the address belongs to one of these neighborhoods, they assume you're a gang member. If you're stopped by another gang member, they ask for your ID, and they assume you to be from another gang. And so the youth, literally, the one that I sat next to says, he was married, he's married and had a child. I don't leave my house. And when I leave to buy bread and milk, I go out, and I'm not sure if I'm ever coming back, because I live in one of these neighborhoods. And I met him because he was in a training program from money on U.S. aid that was training them in software programming. And they were training hundreds of these youth to be programmers with software. Now, imagine that. I've just met with the FBI and seen how they're using the money that we're using in these countries to protect us here in the United States. I've just met with these youth, and we've seen how the money is spent to keep them in El Salvador and keep them from wanting to migrate to the United States. And literally on our way to meet the president of El Salvador, we get the news that the president has cut off that aid to El Salvador. And we then arrived at our meeting with the president and had this discussion with the president. I was very impressed with him. He did not use the opportunity to complain. He did not use the opportunity to whine. He simply said, we must have the United States as a partner, and we must have help. And it's just too important. We've got to figure out a way to do this. And he acknowledged, as did the President of Colombia and the President of Mexico, that they really have no choice but to be a good partner of the United States and do everything they can to work with us to solve these very, very, very complex problems that we have with migration, with corruption, and everything, and starvation and everything that they're involved in. Well, we left El Salvador and went to the Juarez-El Paso border and saw the massive humanity that is there. And interestingly, as we were on our way to that stop, the president announced that he was closing the Mexican border. And later that afternoon, we had a meeting with the president of Mexico. I want you to know, likewise, much like the others we met, he did not complain a bit about the situation, the fact that the president had threatened to close the border. He simply said, our relationship with you is too important. We have to figure this out, and was very complimentary. Somebody in the group actually asked him how his relationship was with the president. And he said, fine, good, we talk. And I appreciated that it was so positive. There was no undermining of the United States or the president at all. It was just a really positive attitude. Well, you can see why this is so timely for me to be here with you today and to comment on these. And I just want to share from my perspective how valuable the U.S. leadership role is around the world. And you can look at this from a philanthropic perspective and say it's the right thing to do. You can look at this from a selfish perspective. I guess that's not quite the right word, but that it actually saves us money. You can look at it from a lot of perspectives. Any way you want to slice this, I truly believe it's in America's best interest to show leadership around the world. And I want you to know how proud I am in these different countries that I've visited, everywhere from Azerbaijan to Guyana to El Salvador, to see the work that is being done in these countries. And I would say and comment too that it is important to ask for accountability for these dollars. I think President Trump is right in his insistence that the dollars are spent well. I think that's a fair question. I have seen programs that I would be embarrassed to actually come back and tell you about in the way that money is spent. And we have to admit we don't get it right every time. You all are, many of you in business, you don't get everything right? Every time you do it. Not every advertising campaign is the best campaign. And what do? You retool and do it right. And so I do think it's important that we don't just assume because we're spending money, good things are happening. We have a right to ask for that accountability, but I want you to know you would be very proud of the work the United States is doing all around the globe. And I'm just delighted to be here, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Let's give another round of applause to Congressman Curtison. I mean, what a great, great story. Now you know why we love to have him in Washington. I'm glad he gets away from those mountains every now and then. Vice Admiral Gallagher, thank you so much for joining us. And Utah's own Derek Miller, thank you for joining us again today. We do want this to be a conversation, so we do want to get you all involved and answer whatever questions you have about America's global engagement. But I'm going to kick it off with just a couple of questions. And you know, every morning I get up, I do this ritual. First thing I do is check my phone, and then the second thing I do is turn on the TV and start watching the news. And every day without fail, I see something in the news about Russia, about China, about Yemen, and now more and more about Venezuela and other countries. So I want to kick off the conversation about national security. And so Admiral Gallagher, I'm going to start with you. You know, I mentioned the combatant commander's statement that we had that was released a couple of weeks ago, but actually over the course of the last couple of months, our regional combatant commanders have been testifying in front of Congress. Many of them have shared their support for development and diplomacy and talked about how critical it is to our national security. Thank you for your service. And looking at your time in uniform, I wonder if you could talk about your personal experiences and how you've seen development and diplomacy play a role in our national security interests.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. As a former Navy fighter pilot,
Got to turn your voice on.
Yep.
There you go.
You may need to boost me just a little bit. As a former Navy fighter pilot, I normally didn't have trouble being heard, but please pardon me today for my lack of voice. As a little bit of framing, Carrie, my final 3 assignments, it was mentioned that I was the U.S. military representative to NATO before I took the uniform off 6.5 years ago. Prior to that, I was Deputy Commander, U.S. European Command, and prior to that, I was the Operations Officer for U.S. European Command as well. And in those days, starting 14 years ago, UCOM coordinated U.S. operations, U.S. military operations, not only on the continent of Europe, but also Africa and a big part of Asia as well. So that's sort of my framing from those days. We work so closely together. You talked about the regional combatant commands. I think everybody realizes there are 6.
It's just not meant to be.
How's that?
Is it turned on? Let's see. Nope. Is it turned on?
Hello? Testing? Testing.
Doesn't sound like that.
Doesn't sound like that.
Emily, do we have the other microphone?
How about this
We
one?
can
Is this
share.
working?
Do you want to?
Here. I can give
How
him
about
a...
this one?
No.
Let's try that one.
Here we go. One more.
Speak into that one.
Speak into this.
How about this?
There we go.
Much better. We'll share. So there are 6 regional combatant commands that span the globe. And they coordinate all U.S. military activity. So in the news, for instance, you'll hear about Central Command because they are in fact in charge of operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, just for an example. So European Command in the early days, you mentioned PEPFAR, so let me pick up on that. So under President Bush, and I think the number was $5 billion was what he spent helping the people of Africa, and hopefully he will be well remembered for that. And there was a military component to that. And so the U.S. military's job was to help build testing centers so that when young men and women applied to join the military in their particular country, they could be appropriately tested, and then if cleared, then join the military. And so the U.S. military was involved in that, even though it was a State Department-led effort. So we worked very closely, daily, constantly, with the State Department, and particularly with the ambassadors, the individual ambassadors and country teams in each of those countries. 93 in my early days, and then 53 when we created AFRICOM, and we split. The relationship with the ambassadors is critical, and we work very closely together to the point where some of the money that they spend actually is DoD money, properly transferred and authorized by Congress to do that. So it's an extraordinary close relationship. Where as a deputy commander, I would get phone calls from ambassadors who would say, "Okay, my call sign's Weasel. Hey, Weasel, I need your help. I need X amount of money to help." Yes, you can. Please do. A lot of people do. And so it is not apparent, probably from a lot of headlines, just how closely we absolutely depend on each other. And there are many times, and you probably understand this, but if it's in a declared area of hostilities, then if it's a U.S. operation, the U.S. will be in charge of that area. But if it's not a declared area of hostilities, the U.S. ambassador in that country is actually the senior person as the representative of the president. And so many, many times I'd send people forward to operate, and they would actually come under the authority of the U.S. ambassador in that particular nation. So again, very, very close cooperation if that helps, but I'm happy to follow up more if you like.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And I do want to say we are sort of running a little bit behind, so I'm going to tack on two questions real quick, both for you, Congressman Curtis and Jeff Miller, and they sort of fall in line. One's about national security and one's about economic opportunity. Can you all hear me without the microphone? Because I don't think this one's working either. So my question is, I recently read that by 2030, about 2 billion people, God, can you imagine, 2 billion people are going to live in weak or fragile and conflict states. It's an astounding number in a very short period of time. So my two questions that go to you, Congressman Curtis, and then you, Derek, are when we look at these weak and fragile states, we know that opens up individuals to pandemics. We know it opens them up to be more vulnerable to natural disasters, violent extremism, and also, as you talked about early, migration, the root causes of migration. So from a national security perspective, Congressman, how do these investments in development and diplomacy help deal with the drivers of fragility in some of these states? And for Derek, to you, from an economic perspective, in order for American businesses, Utah businesses, members of your organization, to be able to go into new markets, you've got to have stable states, and that requires good governance, that requires rule of law. So from your perspective, what's the importance of getting it right from a national security perspective, but also from an economic development opportunity perspective?
Sure.
Go ahead, Congressman.
Let me just refer back to my trip again and tell you that the presidents of El Salvador, Colombia, and Mexico unanimously said the same thing. The people are fleeing our country, not because they want to, but because they are desperate for economic opportunity. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, at the border, I assumed that many of the people that would show up at the border would be claiming asylum. A, because they are legitimate safety fears in their countries, and B, because it's the easiest way in. It's not what they told us. The majority of the people at the border are claiming economic development hardships. They would stay in their countries if they could. And because of the economies of their country, they're leaving their countries.
The answer to the economic question, I think, is quite simple, and that is there are two things that every business craves and every business needs, and the first is stability and the second is predictability. If we don't have those two things, then capital stays on the sidelines and businesses and corporations stay on the sidelines, and we don't have economic growth. I would put it, by the way, into the context, a very broad historical context of prior to World War I, prior to World War II, this country was not only not a world superpower, it could be, I think, pretty accurately described as sort of a backwater developing country. In reluctant ways and for good reason, the country got involved in both of those wars, but it gave an opportunity, very costly to the United States, very costly to the world, but necessary. But it gave an opportunity to create a global order that was done intentionally. And our economy is not the largest, most innovative economy in the world by accident. It's directly the result of that global world order that the U.S. created with NATO, with the Marshall Plan, many other important things that were done. So we'd have to ask ourselves, number one, why would we ever undo that? We created it. Why would we not invest in it? Why would we not continue to move it forward? Why would we do anything that would undermine or undo it? And secondly, I hope it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone in this room that although the United States is the #1 economy in the world, that there is a very real intentional and purposeful effort for China to become the #1 economy in the world. They've got a 100-year plan. And if we don't get our act together, it's going to be a lot shorter than 100 years.
You must have seen my notes and gave me the transition to go into China, because I did want to talk about that. And Congressman Curtis, you mentioned China earlier, and really the efforts that they're making, not just around the globe, not just in the developing world, but specifically in the not just in the developed world, but specifically in the developing world. Derek, you mentioned the Marshall Plan. China right now, for those of you who might not know, is spending 7 times what we spend on the Marshall Plan. And think of the return on investment from that, of rebuilding Europe and the alliances we've made now and the economic opportunities. And you look now, and China is spending, they've increased their spending in development programs by 520%. There's something that they know. They have increased their budget for diplomacy spending under President Xi. They doubled it. So again, there's something that they know. So, Congressman, first I ask you, not just from the economic opportunities that Derek was talking about, but that too, what would happen if we pull back from that area, from the developing world, and again, not just in Africa, but in Latin America, where you just came from?
Yeah. Clearly, the void will be filled. I think that's what everybody needs to understand, is that it would create a void, it would be filled, and it would be China, and that is not in our best interest. China, many years ago, when I lived in Asia in 1979, was viewed as somebody that we needed to help. That's changed, and over the years, they've moved into actually a competitor. And what people, I think, do not realize, I actually heard a presidential candidate last night said the biggest threat in the world was Russia. That is not true. China has now moved not from a competitor, but to an enemy. And the United States hasn't fully grasped that yet.
It's interesting, our president and CEO just got back from a trip to Africa. When she landed, she tells this story of how there's this beautiful airport getting built beside this one airport that must have been built in the 1960s, and it's all glass and all beautiful, and it's all Chinese signs around it. And what that means for the people there and the opportunity for them and the alliances that we're missing out on if we're not there doing that work and creating the economic opportunity that we're talking about. But, and that's an economic program, but I want to also pick back up on the development program that you talked about, you referenced in Venezuela, or in the Northern Triangle. So you talked about El Salvador in particular, and the program you were talking about, I'm curious if it was the one with USAID that they transplanted some work that they've done in LA to decrease the murder rates in LA and picked it up and used it in El Salvador as an effort to build youth centers for children in at-risk neighborhoods and teach them the vocational, the technology training you were talking about, and keep them off the streets. And then you referenced, the president's announcement of withdrawal of foreign assistance. And I'm curious, since you were there firsthand and you got to see the positive work that was being done there, what would the impact be if we're not there?
So, to a person, and I mentioned there were Republicans and Democrats on this, to a person, we also had the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. To a person, we unanimously agreed that safety of the United States would be compromised and migration would increase.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing there is we need to keep the foreign assistance there to keep us safe.
We're actually, because we had the ranking member and the chair there, they've actually agreed to come back, and we're going to have a hearing on this very topic next week.
Well, that's good to know. Let us know what we can do to be helpful with the hearing. So the last round of questioning we want to talk about, I think you've seen the theme of today's program about the economic opportunity, national security, and lastly, I do want to talk about the humanitarian values. So I'm going to pose a quick question to the audience. Poverty is defined as living on less than $1.90 a day, $1.90 a day. And I'm curious of how many people think that global poverty has increased over the last 25 years? Anyone? One, two, good. How many think that it's stayed the same over the last 25 years? Anyone? How many people think that it has decreased over the last 25 years? Wow, this is a smart room. You're smarter than 95% of the Americans who actually believe that it's gone up over the last 25 years. And so not only have we decreased poverty, but we've also decreased the number of children under the age of 5 who are dying from preventable diseases. God, we've cut that in half and poverty in half. Think of what we can do around the world. So Vice Admiral Gallagher, I want to talk to you just a little bit about our disaster response and how the military and development and diplomacy programs, our diplomats and our people doing work on the ground, work with the military. I know that this is one place where you all work closely, particularly like now you have the cyclone that just hit in East Africa and the horrible spread of Ebola that's happening now. I'd love to hear your insights of how the military works with these programs.
To begin with, we have to be asked. So you can't just roll into a country with, 20 C-17s and say, we're here to help you. The leadership of the country has to ask us in, and it's then coordinated with the U.S. Embassy presence in that country. And, oh, by the way, you heard about the NSC earlier today. It gets debated in the NSC. It's debated throughout Washington. It's an interagency process that comes together. Whole of government might be another term that you could use, that says, okay, well, what can we do? What's being asked for? What do we want to do? Because all of these questions have to be properly answered. And then if it's humanitarian assistance or disaster relief in a particular country, the U.S. ambassador is actually in charge. That's the person in charge, and again coordinated with the rest of our government. And so the military is then asked for help, and there's a very well-defined process for how that happens. So the State Department will then request assistance, and it goes through a legal and economic review, and then the military will help. So the 101st Airborne deploying to Liberia. By the way, I was in Liberia a number of years ago when the Chinese were rebuilding the soccer stadium for $1 billion, and this was 15 years ago. The 101st Airborne deployed to specifically build 17 hospitals. That was their specific mission, not to treat people. There were lots of other people doing that. But they were given a very well-defined mission and then given the resources to do that. And, oh, by the way, something we know how to do fairly well. So very well-coordinated effort.
15 years ago, that means that they've been there a while doing this work. We've got some catching up to do, it sounds like. So, Derek, I want to transition to you to talk a little bit about, Congressman Curtis referenced in his remarks public-private partnerships and the importance of the private sector working with the government, because the government can't and shouldn't do it alone. The private sector can't and shouldn't do it alone, but there is this cohesive work that the private sector does with the government. And we've talked about disaster relief and we've talked about pandemics, but there's also global poverty and there's access to electricity and what that means. And so I'm just, from your perspective, would love to hear about how we leverage the strengths of the public-private partnerships, both sectors, the government and private entity, to tackle these development challenges, and how Utah companies play a role there.
Well, I appreciate the question because it is true that the stability provides an opportunity for economic development, and so it is an economic imperative, but it is also a moral imperative, and there is a lot that can be done with the private sector working with the public sector. We see this all around the world now, where we have many companies, in fact, many Utah companies that are engaged in really neat and important and beneficial projects all around the world, whether that's in Africa, whether that's in the Middle East, whether that's in Latin America. And so I look at it from the standpoint of it's an investment. We've talked about how it's an investment. It's an investment in building our economy here, but it's also an investment in people's lives. We have more refugees than any other time in the world's history today. We have more displaced persons around the world than any other time in the history of the world today. I was in Jordan just a few months ago. From the civil war in Syria, the country of Jordan has taken in 1 million refugees. We're proud that we've taken in 10,000. They've taken in 1 million. It's a country of a population of 10 million. I mean, could you imagine having your population, 1/10, 10% come in, and not just come in, but in dire need? So this is not just devastating to a country, challenging to a country, to its economy, but to those lives as well.
The impact that we can make, and really the instability that creates in Jordan, who's a key ally of the United States in that region. So we need to be there with the public-private partnerships. So I do want to open these up to questions, so I'm going to ask this last question. And Emily, hopefully we have a working microphone, so we'll have some staff walking around. So raise your hand if you have a question. But so as people are thinking about it, Congressman Curtis, I want to ask you this last question. I don't want to make it sound all dire. There are some great things that are happening. And America loves an underdog, and they love entrepreneurs. They like people to be able to, get the bootstraps pulled up and making success of themselves. And so we're doing some work in this area as well. So really when it comes to opportunities for women around the world and women and girls, and there are two initiatives that this administration and this Congress have passed and have implemented. One of them, and it's a tongue twister, one of them is called the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Opportunity Act. And the other is called the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative. And they really are going to do some great things for women and girls around the globe. And Congressman Curtis, I just want to ask you if you could talk a little bit about, expand on these a little bit, and why it matters to invest in women and girls around the globe to lift people out of poverty.
Well, the easy answer is that it's half the population. And so if we're ignoring them, we're missing half of our resources. But let me tell you a quick anecdote that I think would tell you how we're doing. In these countries that I visited, and I'm actually going to include one more, the Native Americans, the Navajo reservation I was at a week and a half ago, with the exception of one country that I won't name, as I sat around the table of their leadership, their cabinets, there were a lot of women representing these different entities in these different countries. And every one of them I looked at and I said, holy cow, that's a qualified, sharp person. That person could lead the country. And it was really impressive to me to see, and to be honest with you, my impression was we're actually lagging as the United States in this category for many of our countries around the world.
It's interesting that the first female ambassador to the United States was just here, and so the difference that we're making that was in Afghanistan, the difference that we're making in Afghanistan and lifting women up, and the benefit that's going to be. I also, you may know a little something about this with your time in Africa about how investing in women and girls. Studies have proven that investing in women and girls, and they put the money back into their family, back into their business, back into their opportunities to grow, whereas otherwise it may just go in their pockets and not investing. I don't know if you have any experience in seeing that.
Well, I would include Afghanistan in that as well. The training that was done there, both English language and math, was not just for the military. It was also to be passed down in the family units. And if you look at the history under the Taliban, there was no training for women and girls at all. And today, I think you'd be surprised at the statistics of those that are actually going to school. So, but to your point, Carrie, when you invest in that half of the population, you're investing in the country. Absolutely.
So let's open it up to the audience. Who has a question? Just raise your hand and we'll have some staff come over. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm trying to formulate this, so forgive me if it's a little raw. I love that you're investing in women and children. I think that's great. But I also know that we are missing a focus on little boys. I've seen that. I work in radicalization, threat neutralization, prevention, and what I'm seeing is a lost generation. I'm seeing these kids who have been raised as foreign fighters or are traveling to become foreign fighters, and they're not getting the help they need. They are victims of rape. They are victims of atrocious crimes. And while we focus on women and children, we're missing half of the little boys. So what programs or what plans do you have in place that removes the gender aspect and looks at violence against humanity as violence against humanity instead of pitting one against the other in a zero-sum mentality?
Is that to
anyone?
Well, I'll just tell you my impression, and she listed a couple that were specifically targeted at women, but my impression is really all of these USAID programs around the globe are blind to male or female. The rooms that I've been in where these programs are being implemented really show a good representation of both. I think in my most recent visit, what I've seen that's most relevant probably to young men would be the work on the gangs. It's just almost impossible for them to not get engaged in a gang. I think that's a critical point for us. If we lose them to a gang, the term they used down there was blood in and blood out. Once they get in, they don't leave these gangs. And I think that's at least one example, one critical example of work that we're doing.
May I follow up? Sure. So with that understanding that, thank you. So with the understanding that they are becoming radicalized into something, some type of belongingness, and also understanding that migration is hybrid warfare as it changes cultures and communities. I am noticing a trend that we are very focused on far-right extremism, and we're banning all sorts of communications, but we're missing the far left. And so how can you swing back to a balanced central approach that allows for belonging, the fundamental human needs, right? How can we capture the minds and the hearts of these children to prevent them from becoming gang members and bleeding in and bleeding out?
I can tell you what I've seen is this attempt to give them education, to give them alternatives, everything from athletics to studying to things that, that we hope every young person has an opportunity to do. And I think that's the critical role of these programs that we're talking about, is they do try to replace that and give them an alternative.
How would you have us fulfill that role?
Well, I think, in my specific role, and I feel like I'm taking all the time here, but it's to support the United States in that effort. You hear loud cries to stop the foreign aid, to stop the funding, to contact your representatives and your elected officials and let them know that you support it. We generally hear what you don't like. We rarely hear what you like, if that makes sense. And I think that'd be a great place to start.
I will promise you, we will provide that opportunity for you. So we will follow up with this right afterwards. And I would just also like to add on that there are other programs that deal that I think address some of the questions that you have before it becomes violent. I think about Power Africa and the fact that we're providing and we're working to provide electricity to so many people who don't have it and what that means for them. And I never really got my head around that until, again, our president and CEO was telling me about a time that she went to Africa and this little girl came running up to her and hugged her and said, "Thank you so much. I go to school, but I can't do my homework when I get home because I don't have electricity. I don't have a light source to read my books that I'm supposed to read, so I'm not prepared the next day." So we're giving them that education opportunity that the Congressman was referring, that hopefully mitigates them from going and getting involved before it becomes extreme. Yes, Derek?
A few years ago, the state of Utah took a trade mission led by the governor to Israel. It was actually led by Spencer Eccles, who's here when he was running the governor's office of economic development. And Spencer will remember we had the opportunity to meet with the then president of the country, Shimon Peres. This was an individual, as we were walking into the room, the consul general who had helped facilitate this trade mission, he tugged on my sleeve and he said, as we were walking into the room, "Derek, this would be like if you were meeting with George Washington." And I got a surprised look on my face, and so he went on to explain. He said, "This is one of the founders of our country. He fought in our War of Independence. He helped create the government. He served in every ministerial cabinet position there is, including serving as prime minister twice. And now he is the president of our country." At the time, he was 90 years old. And he has since, and within the last couple of years, passed away. But I'll never forget, with that introduction, one of the things that President Perez shared with our group was this: the key to lasting peace is economic prosperity. And I think about that in the context in which that man lived his entire life, in pretty unpeaceful situations most of his life. But he had this understanding that if the key to getting people out of those violent situations is by giving them opportunity. And I believe that.
It's powerful. Very great. Admiral, you said you had some thoughts.
Yeah, just a couple of maybe final thoughts on this great topic. Counter-radicalization. Well, the U.S. government's been working on this, has actually had pretty well-developed program for a number of years now, an interagency effort to do things that may sound mundane, but first you have to look at the target audience. So if it's young boys that you're trying to either unradicalize, which is difficult to do, or maybe turn them early to, to the moderate path and keep them on the moderate path. Well, you can produce movies that emphasize democracy. You can produce TV shows that have traditional democratic values built into them, and that actually has been an effort that's been ongoing for a number of years now. The U.S. military gets involved with this with websites that we build in conjunction with the various embassies in the regions that again emphasize, depending on the target audience and what are they interested in. One site, Southeast European Times, might have sports incorporated in it to at least open the door. And then the messaging is there, which is, hey, the pro-democracy messages, pro-moderate messages. In others, very sophisticated discussions go on with no sports at all in the Maghreb region. And again, these are U.S. efforts. And no one thing is going to solve this problem. But it takes a concerted effort by the entirety of our nation to help with this, but also to get the greater coalition working, because this is a worldwide problem that you've identified.
Who else has a question? Yes, get a microphone to you.
Hi, the 1% of the federal spending number actually impressed me as a lot of money. And so my question is, what are we doing to make sure that the money being spent is being spent effectively and efficiently? We know that we can spend money around the world, and then that investment will be seen as American imperialism, or, we're the big guy in the block and other countries just like to beat up on us anyways. How do we make sure that we're having the desired effects with these investments, which of course are going to vary from, every one is going to be different. So how do we make sure that the investment is effective and that the public understands the necessity of those investments?
So fortunately, we have the expert on the House Foreign Affairs Committee here to answer just that question. So Congressman, I will turn that to you.
I was surprised to learn in El Salvador that the U.S. Embassy employed 600 people. And the reason I bring that up is I think sometimes our paradigm is that this 1% is all going into these countries to give aid. Does that make sense? I was also surprised to learn that the FBI's efforts in El Salvador were paid for with this foreign aid. And so, first of all, I don't have the numbers, but it would be really healthy to be able to answer your question, to say, well, X% of this simply supports our efforts overseas for American employees, and it's a pretty hefty amount. And then I mentioned in my remarks earlier that it is fair to ask for accountability, and I think the answer to your question is, I've seen programs that I wouldn't come back and brag about. I wouldn't refund some of these programs. So unless we're asking for measurable results and then taking the time to measure them, I don't think we're spending our taxpayer dollars wisely. And I think we owe that to the taxpayers to insist on some kind of return for that. And I think it's also fair to say, look, we understand there's going to be some experimenting. You're going to have some programs that will flop. We understand that. It's okay. But get rid of that and start a new program instead of funding that over and over again. I also think it's critical that we start programs that have a hope of sustaining themselves. So we start maybe by funding it 100% and say, look, in a year, we're going to fund this 80%, and then we're going to fund it 70%. And so these things have the ability to grow themselves. And I'm very confident, and what I saw in these leaders when they weren't complaining about us cutting off aid is they want to be independent. They don't like this position that they're in. They truly aspire to be independent, but they need help getting there, and that's what they're asking for.
Congressman, I love what you said, that the goal here is to make these sustainable. The idea of teaching a man to fish instead of giving a man a fish. And Mark Green, who's the current administrator of USAID, he's a former ambassador to Tanzania, actually was a great partner and used to be on the board of U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, but has a much larger mission now. Talks all the time about how USAID's goal ultimately is to not be in existence anymore, to be in a place where people can sustain themselves, that we've provided opportunity for these countries and these people to sustain themselves, So we don't need USAID anymore. It's a lofty goal. It's an ambitious, aspirational one, but hopefully we can do it. Who else has a question? I think we have time for maybe one, maybe two more. Anyone? Yes.
Thank you for this opportunity. China has been mentioned a number of times in this panel, and I'm going to Shanghai tomorrow. And I wanted to hear what are some of the strategies that you are using to cope with this perceived new enemy now?
You're not going to tell them if we share the strategy.
I think, you know, many people here probably have some dealings, you know, with China in business, in education. But I think, you know, just as a civilian, what are some of the things that you think we should be doing? Or
from a business standpoint, these two can speak from a government standpoint, but you actually answered your own question from a business standpoint, and that is having those economic relationships, having those business relationships. There's, you know, I'm a believer in free trade, but free trade can't just be free, it has to be fair. And we do need to make sure that the trade that we have with China, or frankly any other country, is fair trade. But that doesn't just happen on a government-to-government level. It happens on a business-to-business and individual-to-individual level. And one of the ways that we have, when you look at back at the history of this country, when you see that some of our enemies are now some of our strongest allies, it was through trade.
I'm not a fan of the tariffs, but we have to admit that the imbalance is dramatic, and we are subsidizing their efforts. And so I do think that as a country, we need to insist on more fair practices. A lot of our trade, our secrets, our intellectual property is being taken advantage, and we need to stop that and stop giving them this unfair advantage. As far as the influence around the world, and I think I also want to use this opportunity to clarify, when I say they're our enemy, I refer to a philosophy, not individuals as a country. Does that make sense? I wouldn't want to be misunderstood with that. But their strategy around the world is to go into these countries and offer a deal that cannot be refused. And so it might be a port. We'll help you build this port, and we'll loan you this money and at this interest rate. And then you get into the fine details of this, and these countries do not have the ability to make those payments. And so inevitably you'll see around the world they're foreclosing on ports and property and railroads, and they've got this one belt, one trade philosophy around the world. And we have to intervene in that. We have to get into these countries and help them understand why that is a bad deal. And so I believe American business can compete for these ports and things like that, but only on a level playing field. And we've got to insist and figure out how to make that level, that playing field level, so that we're not losing vast resources around the globe and giving China this huge strategic advantage.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? I'll just speak loud. Because I'm involved in the education business, I think I've read someplace a study. On average, one student that comes over from China to study in the U.S., on average, they spend about $50,000 US dollars per year. And so that is a very good, business to the U.S., but it seems like we have this perception now, we don't want any more students coming into the U.S. Is that really a true policy, or is this just something that we read in the news? Because you have so many people, say, getting a visa to the U.S. to study in the last couple of years have been just increasingly more difficult.
I don't know how to best answer that. I don't think there's a strategic philosophy to keep students out. I think now you're playing into this whole immigration debate, and we could spend the next 6 weeks here without leaving and not solve that.
And no more cake.
Yeah, but I think you're probably seeing more influence from our inability to agree on immigration than on that specific issue.
So we have to wrap it today up, and you all do need to get back to work, but I really could sit here for 6 more weeks, not talking about immigration, but talking about these issues. But we've focused a lot on challenges, on crises, on problems around the world. So I really always like to have people leave the room with inspiration and something that makes you feel good about our work around the world. So I'm going to pose this question to all 3 of you. And the question is, in your experience with what you've seen, can you share a personal story of inspiration where you've seen development and diplomacy make a difference in the lives of others? So we'll start with you, Admiral.
Great question. I always come back to, keep the main thing the main thing. So if you're talking about the United States military, it's our young men and women who are fighting, dying, getting wounded in the service of this nation, defending our Constitution against all enemies. And they are the most wonderful ambassadors we could have anywhere in this world at any point in time. And we don't need to give them talking points. We don't need to tell them what to say because they tell their stories. And they're happy to do it. So in this regard, they work very closely with many countries. And in partial answer to the last set of questions, the best thing we can do in competition, short of war, with other countries is to be there to compete, to have us there. And that's one of the reasons that our young men and women are deployed in so many places. It's because it's actually good for us to be there to represent our democratic values, and our folks do that extremely well.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to see you the best.
Okay.
Sorry, Darren.
I actually wanted to say at the beginning of my remarks how honored I was to be part of this panel. It sort of reminds me of the 3 tenors. You've got Pavarotti and Placido Domingo, and then the other guy that nobody could remember. So. I had the opportunity recently to go to Vietnam, and I was excited to do so. I'd never been to Vietnam before. The only thing that I knew about Vietnam is that this country had fought a war there. And so because of that, and because that was an era that I had grown up in, I will confess I went with some apprehension, not knowing how I would be received. Not knowing how our delegation of other Americans would be received. We were so warmly received. I mean, these were beautiful, welcoming, friendly people. And I will never forget, from the cab driver who picked us up at the airport all the way to our top government meetings, the mayor of Hanoi and so forth, every single person we met when they found out that we were America said the same thing, from America said the same thing to us. They said, "Oh, you're from America. We want to be your friend. Don't you want to be our friend? We want to be your friends."
Congressman?
I'm so glad you asked this question because I'd love to share this. I want you to know, and you're probably tired of hearing about my trip, but one more story about my trip. Everywhere we went, and you've probably experienced this, somebody would walk up to me and say, "I'm from Utah." And this delegation from New York and California, all these big states, started to feel like Utah was swinging above its weight overseas. And I want you to know it's true that the director of the program that taught software to kids in El Salvador grew up in Utah. And the FBI agent, the lead agent in charge in El Salvador, kids are at BYU. And everywhere we would go, my colleagues were noticing this phenomenon that was happening. And in our very last meeting, it was with the president of Mexico. And I'm looking around the room going, there is no chance, because it was his cabinet only there. There is a connection to Utah here. And just as I thought there was no chance, the translator introduced herself and said, "I grew up in Provo, Utah." So I just want our guests to know that Utah swings above its weight. I think this is a state that desperately cares about what's happening around the world, that wants to have an influence, and are touching these individual lives and making a difference. And I see it firsthand.
Great. Well, can I get a big round of applause for our panelists today? I also want to give a big round of applause for all of you for being here and attending this conversation. And like I said in the beginning, hopefully we have some new friends after today's conversation. And the person you need to talk to is the person who oversees our work here, the second most important person in the room. Luke Wentz, will you please come up and close us out today?
Thank you guys for bearing with me a little bit. My name is Luke Wentz, and I'm the Western Regional Outreach Director here for the USGLC, and I have the great honor of working here and managing our operations here in Utah and across the western region of the United States. And Congressman Curtis, we are so thankful, and we want to say thanks not just for lending your time with us today for this incredibly important, timely discussion, but thank you for your leadership and your dedication to America's strategic global engagement through development and diplomacy alongside defense. Truly, your work in Congress, and more importantly for this conversation on foreign affairs, is absolutely imperative, and we can see it across the board here in Utah. Utah is a global community, and we thank you for all of your work. Can we get another round of applause for Congressman Curtis? And as you all may know, Utah is blessed to have Congressman Curtis in office, not just for his leadership in foreign affairs, but he arguably has the best sock collection in all of the United States House of Representatives. So here at USGLC, we wanted to contribute, Congressman, to your sock collection with our very own pair of Leading Globally Matters for Utah socks. So, Congressman. As many of you know here across the room, my favorite part of my job is having the opportunity to speak with all of you and to get to know these great panelists and the people in the room. Before I get into that, I want to thank you, Admiral and Derek, for your time and for your willingness to join us in the panel, and for the remainder of our speakers, Mircea, Miles, and Terry, thank you very much. My favorite part is to have the opportunity to get to know you. Utah is obviously an absolutely imperative part of our global community. It's the work that you guys are doing in the context of international development and diplomacy and global trade is really making Utah an example for the rest of the country. And a lot of that is because of the great work of the people around this room. And that's all great, but what does that mean, and where do we go from here? So first, we need your continued voice. We need you to be engaged and to talk about why it's important that the U.S. continues to be engaged with the world, why these development and diplomacy programs are so important. And when Congressman Curtis or other members of the Utah delegation stands out and supports these programs, write his office a letter. Seriously, he probably gets a lot of negative letters, and those positive ones matter. Reach out to your local newspaper and call your local radio station, and most importantly, talk about it to your family, to your friends, to your colleagues. The people in this room truly have the potential to make a significant impact. And for that reason, I'd like to invite you all to join USGLC's annual State Leaders Summit that we're hosting this June 17th and 18th in Washington, D.C. It's 2 great days of exciting speakers, and we have great networking opportunities and an opportunity to communicate with your federal delegation. So I'll just close it off with this. Utah truly is a phenomenal place to live, work, and raise the family. You guys understand why it's important that we're engaged in the world, and it's because of you that America remains the greatest force of good in the world. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Congressman Curtis, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.